Hello, everybody, and welcome to this week's episode of Let's Pick This Up Next Week. I am Dee, and I'm here with the very handsome DJ.
Hi, everybody.
I feel like we have to have like a hi, DJ moment. Hi, I'm super stoked. We picked an interesting topic for the day, which I think is really timely because we just hit like Super Tuesday, and it's an election year. And so the idea of politics is really on people's mind. So I thought it'd be really good to talk about it because this is an important topic when we talk about therapy.
I agree. I think that, so many thoughts come into my mind, Dee, when you say that, is that, making sure that we don't interject our own biases, and like, how do we be aware of that as someone is really passionate about politics and talking about their views. And it's even harder, I think, when their views are more aligned with your views.
And there's psychological premise to that, right? Because we like, what's the theory called? It's like similarity bias or something like that. The more similar we feel to someone, the more we like them, even when that's not. The more biased we treat them.
Yeah, good point.
So, question for you: is counseling inherently political?
I don't think it's inherently political, but I think that, I am working with a client who is, of a different background, different culture, different beliefs as far as like family system looks like, very kind of like what we would think of like traditional. And I think in those sessions, is when I'm most aware of how to make sure that I'm being very, very culturally competent, that I am trying to be more objective and making sure that a lot of subjectivity doesn't come into it, because this person is still working on identifying what their own values are. And I think that, if we look at like the way that we're trained, especially if we're in K-12 schools, right? We're very much into social justice.
All of them have to be now.
Right. And so
which,
a lot
by
of
the
times
way, I want to define what K-CREP is for a moment before we
Yes.
So K-CREP. So DJ and I both have master's degrees in counseling. That's what makes us, we're probably gonna do a whole episode on different licensure, but basically the states that we practice in require licensure to do the level that we do. And so to be licensed in some states, you have to have a master's degree. We both have master's degrees. That's where we met, was in grad school. So when you go to grad school, the school has to be accredited in order for you to test for a certain license. And so the school that we went to is K-CREP, still is K-CREP accredited, which is, I don't know, one's very specific to counseling. I forget what K-CREP stands for.
Is counseling accreditation? No, certification. I don't know. I can't remember what it stands for. Also, my PhD program is K-CREP accredited as well.
Yes. So that allows us to have, or that is what allowed us to get licensed, because education alone doesn't give you a license. You have to pass a test and all these other lovely things. And DJ knows all about the lovely things whenever you change states in practice. And sometimes you have to redo an entire practicum because every state is different, which is awful and is a whole different issue. But also that's political, right? Because like we've talked about before that, for example, like there's a lot of legislation right now to try to get like interstate compacts basically for counselors. Right. Because is it fair that like I have an office that's like right on the river, like right in the Ohio River, and it's not uncommon when you live on the river that you just pop back and forth between the states all the time, like anytime you live really close to a border. And so does it make sense that I can literally look at my client's house from across the river, but I can't treat them when they're physically in that state because I am not licensed in that state? I'm only licensed in the state of Ohio. So why? Like that's a politic thing. It's a whole thing. It's a whole thing.
Especially with telehealth, because, we have more access to people. And like, for example, I live in Portland, Oregon, but all of my clients are in California, and that's where I maintain my license. I'm also licensed in Ohio. But with the counseling compact, it's interesting to see the states and how they prioritize different licenses, because in California, it's an LMFT state, so licensed marriage and family therapists. And so they're not part of the counseling compact because it's not a license that's very popular in California, even though I'm an LPCC in California. But other
Which is a
states who
licensed
prioritize,
professional clinical counselor.
yes. So other states that prioritize that license are in the counseling compact, which means that you can see people in different states across the borders, where wherever you are, which is great for telehealth. And I'm 15 minutes from Washington, but I could get a license in Washington then and be able to see lots of other states because of that license, not because of my license in Oregon, if I'm not licensed in Oregon yet, or California.
But it makes things even more
Very
complicated.
political.
It is, and it ignores, because everyone says, "Oh, we do this for the consumer rights. That's why every state operates on their own," and it's quite silly. I mean, some states even they don't require licenses; they do certifications, which Ohio does do certifications for chemical dependency counselors, or some states have registrations, which is just simply putting your name on a list and saying, "I do this thing,"
Right,
and
right.
so it's
And
a whole mess.
only registrations, right? Some states
It's
only
terrifying.
have that and not the testing and everything that some of the other states like Ohio and California do have more of the testing and making the education requirements. And like we were saying, a lot of licensing boards now are though moving to they want people to have graduated from a K-Crop school.
And then too, of like every state has different. So like the Ohio Counselor, Social Worker, Marriage and Family Therapist Board,
Mm-hmm.
which is the licensing body that oversees all three of those types of licensure, they say that it doesn't matter where the person is a resident of, your client is a resident of. It matters where they physically sit when you're seeing them via telehealth. So like
Exactly. Yes.
I was on the road for work and I had a session with my counselor and I had to cancel it, which is so silly
Right.
because I see her all the time here in Ohio, but I was
Right.
in a different state and she could not see me. And could I technically have said, "Oh yeah, whatever"? But no, because
Right.
my own ethics and moral compass of like
Right.
I'm not going to do that to her. I guess, even though again, who's going to know? But like, it is
Right.
what it is.
I mean,
But it,
you do never know. But also, yeah, so I had a client who I was seeing telehealth in California. I live in Portland, Oregon. She was on a business trip in Portland, literally in the same city with me. And I'm like, I can't see you now. Yeah.
it's dumb and it's political and it has to do with lobbying dollars and what states
Right.
prioritize which type of funding. And so I do think counseling is inherently political because for a variety of reasons, right? So one, our ability to practice in certain ways is political. Why is KCREP? And I don't know, right? Because I'm just spouting off at this point, but like, why is KCREP the gold standard for what a school should be? I'm sure there's some random other accreditation that tried, but why was KCREP the
Right.
one
Why
that
is
was
the
like,
key?
yeah, that's it? And KCREP does really have really good standards. We had a really great educational program. It's really
Right.
solid foundation, but who's to say that like why did they get that right? I don't know.
Right. Right. And K-Crep does have a foundation of social justice, which like, maybe not, in line with some of the more like traditional family values as far as like, what somebody might think is, what gets brought up to me in some of my sessions where I have to think really, really hard about is like how easily we talk about boundaries. But what if a culture doesn't value boundaries? What if cultures don't value independence from their family? I mean, that's something you really have to think about when you're working with somebody from a more traditional kind of background.
Yeah, I've definitely worked with folks, especially you put like the air quotes around traditional, and I'll do the same thing of like that had that more kind of what we think of as a traditional. It was much more Christian based, and so I was treating this individual who was clearly an abusive relationship. They were clearly experiencing domestic violence, and my first instinct, and we'll talk about personal bias, but like my first instinct is to be like, girl, let's make a plan. Let's get you out of there. Right.
Right.
Like that's what we need to do. You got to be safe, man. But for her, like that was a complete non-starter. And so it would be very inappropriate for me. I mean, obviously, as we brainstormed, it's like, let's put this on the list and we can determine if it's a good or bad idea. Because maybe she hadn't thought about it, but she immediately shot it down, and I knew that was going to happen. So that's why I didn't pursue that option. But for
Right.
her, having the nuclear family, staying together for the kids, not being divorced, and what it means, and like, the church and things like that were very important.
Right.
So I had to completely change my interventions because of that,
Right.
even though my values
Right.
don't align with that.
Right, exactly. And I think it is that, and I looked really hard yesterday for a resource for this client about like how to determine like what your own values are. Without the bias that's out there about like, what values should be, again, if you're like prioritizing boundaries and independence and the stuff that we do, and the majority of my work is that, I run a seek and safety group, and that's all about that, and really thinking about like if somebody is in value, they value more, like we're saying, nuclear family values, and maybe independence isn't, it's a family system versus like one person in a family system, then we really do have to like think outside of like what we might normally do. But
Do
it's
you do
not
speaking?
easy. It's not easy to
It's
find.
not.
No.
Do you do, and I'll get back to another part of something you said that was interesting to me, but you said a lot of things interesting to me. A lot of light bulbs going off here, but do you do the value sort card? Just like a complete aside, as like an intervention, the value sort
No,
cards.
I haven't used that.
Oh man,
Is
this is a great intervention. I love it because like I said before, I do a lot of substance use counseling. That's a lot of the people I see, uh, both that have co-occurring, so substance use with mental health, but also just
right.
straight mental health. But anyway, so the value sort, you give them, little 3x5 note cards, poster notes, whatever, uh, and you have them write things that they value. There is like a worksheet or whatever that kind of gets their ideas of what is value. Value is things like I value working hard. I value being independent. I value my family. I value, money. I value safety and security. I value, all those things. So we have like a list that kind of helps them get started on it. But whatever they write down is completely their own. And so they write all these cards, and then you tell them what the kick is, right? Because you never tell them at the beginning. So once they do that, then you say, stack them in order with the most important on top and the least important on bottom. And I get a lot of groans because, like, and I do this in a group. It's like, oh, what do you mean? Like, I value all of these things. And I'm like, yes, but what you need to do is when you sort it, if you put something on top, that means I'm willing to give up whatever is below it for this value, right? So if I'm someone who I both value, uh, you know, self care, but I also value working hard, I have to pick which of those is more important, which of those really aligns with me. So they have to do this, and it's a really interesting exercise to really walk through, especially when people like write like their kids. Oh, when I see people write their kids on the cards, I'm like, this next part's gonna suck for you because then they have to like put where their kids fall in this. But
Right.
then because I do drug and alcohol counseling, I have them write a card that says their most frequent drug used, and I say, when you were in active use, put that card where it was. And so they, some people put it at the very bottom, and I'm like, no, 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 where was it? Right.
Right.
And then I talk about, all right, put it where it belongs. Where do you feel that belongs in your life? And everyone puts it at the bottom. One person like ripped it up, and that was like the most beautiful moment. So it talked about like, yeah, like that your values shift when other things come in play. And so the ultimate point of that was that drugs are someone's top priority. It
Mm,
must be their top value because they are giving up everything else for it. So
right.
anyway, I bring that
Right.
up to say, if you're talking about boundaries, interconnectedness, these other values, try a little value sort.
Right. Right. Nice. And you don't think
So,
about like, I hadn't thought so much about how how much boundaries implies values, And
mm-hmm.
and also I think like when I was looking at like, okay, so if I'm looking at someone establishing their values and they're coming from this more traditional system, but they're not sure if they still want to be in that traditional system, but also then anything like that, and that I could find included religion. So like I'm like, well, we want to stay away from that because I know this person like isn't, that's not where they're at, So like it's one side seems to skew one way and one side seems to skew another way, those extremes, and it's really hard to find something that is completely, totally unbiased and neutral.
There's nothing
Mm.
in this world that is completely unbiased and neutral. There isn't.
Right.
It's
That's
impossible.
yeah, I try to mitigate that by having, a lot of resources for my clients. Like I never want like them to come to therapy and I'm gonna learn like what my values are and I'm gonna learn all this stuff by like coming to therapy with DJ. I want you to read lots of different varied books. I want you to go to like 12-step meetings or support groups or something like that so that you're not getting all of your information just from me. So
Yeah,
much
because
bias.
ultimately, I mean, our purpose as counselors is to counsel ourselves out of jobs. I don't
Right.
want someone to feel like they need me for their ongoing growth. Like
Exactly.
at a certain point, like if someone's in counseling with you for so long and there's not new issues to address, because sometimes there are, and sometimes it's totally okay to have a long term. I'll use my own personal experience. I have a long term counselor that it's a lot of times it's just checking in, right?
Hmm.
It's those sessions of just processing. Okay, what's happened the last month, the last 6 weeks, and that's something I find helpful, just to kind of dedicating that space to always check in with myself. But then I have folks that kind of hang around, and eventually we kind of resolve all their treatment goals, and I'm like, so what do you think? What do you think about closing? What are we doing? And it's because they've become that, not dependent in the same kind of relationship sense, right? And not necessarily codependent, but becomes I am their coping skill. And so I love that
Right.
you're already looking at like, let's give them these other tools, because my job is to not always be here for you.
Right. Right. And I want them to be able to make sure that they're coming to their own conclusions and not conclusions that they think that I want them to come to.
It's interesting, which I agree. Do you see count? Okay, so I'm a big like imagery person. This is so unrelated at this point, but it's just is what it is. Do
Uh-huh.
you see counseling more as like a path that you are like with the client and you're kind of saying like, 'cause I imagine therapy, each session is like going through the woods together, and you can say like, ultimately they're deciding the ways to go. And my job is to
Right.
say, here are all the options, right? So
Right.
this way goes to this way might go to this way might go to this. Do you see that as more of our role, or like breadcrumbing them towards what's the best solution?
I mean, I think it depends. I think that like for some people I think they may need you to lay out like here's an option, here's an option, here's an option, here's an option. And I think other people are more equipped to be able to like kind of like find their way without having all the options laid out. I think it just depends on what, the person's background and experience is.
And I think it's checking our bias with that, because my bias might
Mm-hmm.
be, I know that that's not the right way to go because, X, Y, and Z. And I have to decide in that moment, do I switch hats? Because as a therapist, we're not advice givers. Like the,
Exactly. Right.
the grinds my gears when I hear people say, my friends tell me I give the best advice and I should be a counselor. And I'm like,
Right.
no, that's not a counselor. I don't have
It's a
advice. I
life
don't have good
coach.
advice. Yeah, it's
Right.
life coach. Uh, but my job is to create a safe space in which that you explore and determine what, if any, changes you want or need to make. But when I
Right.
think about what changes someone might need to make, that comes with bias. Like
Right.
it
Right.
does. I have to check that at the door every time.
Right. I mean, there's no way that we can't, we all have blind spots as professionals. We all do have bias. And I think that, like, doing the best that we can to try to mitigate that, but also knowing that, like, I can't give you advice because I'm not living your life. Anything that, I'm going to tell you that's advice is not going to be helpful for you because we don't have the same life circumstances anyway.
No matter how well we know our clients, they are always the expert of their own life. I mean, that's
Right.
just
And that's my approach. But sometimes I think like, my approach is also like I want to empower them to like make decisions
mm,
for themselves. And then I think about, is there bias in that? What if somebody's like, I don't want to be empowered again? Like, I think like that's not my role in my family, right? Like that's not a value for me.
like, I came to you for answers, DJ. Don't tell me or ask me what the answer is. If I knew that, I
Right.
wouldn't
Yeah.
be here. Yeah.
Right. Right. Yeah.
You said something really interesting at the top when I asked, is counseling inherently political? And you said no, and you talked a lot about um, basically like DEI type of stuff, right? Diversity, equity, inclusion.
Right.
But I think DEI has become political.
Oh yeah,
Like,
DEI is political. I mean, that's the thing when I think about like social justice again, I think like we all know like that is politicized. And but I think DEI there's elements of it too that are just like important for cultural diversity. Like, for example, in my company we had an instance where somebody made an assumption. Did we talk about this already? Somebody made an assumption um, based on
I think you and I talked about it. I don't think we
oh
talked about it
yeah.
on the show.
So, like making an assumption that like a counselor might be a cultural match with somebody. And if a patient's like, hey, I want with like you know, a counselor who speaks this language or who has these beliefs, and then somebody makes an assumption based on that, and then matches a therapist with a patient or a client, and then it's bad enough to make those assumptions anyways, but especially if that assumption is incorrect. So I think it is important to have, because I think of that as like something that's DEI, that like, is cultural sensitivity or cultural competence
Cultural
inherently political?
humility is what they're
Yeah,
talking about.
is that political?
I don't think
Question
it,
mark. Hmm.
question mark. I personally don't think it is because I think like that is a core foundation, right? When we talk about our code of ethics as counselors and every, like we talked about earlier, like if you're licensed versus non-licensed, if you're a marriage and family therapist versus a social worker versus a counselor, we all have our different code of ethics, which is so dumb. But they all say the same thing essentially, which talks about we have an obligation to come to things and recognize ethics and diversity. And we have to be able to sit in that and choose culturally appropriate interventions based on that. So we have to. But unfortunately, like the word culture, the word DEI has people like automatically just ready to like throw down. And I'm like, when, like, well, I know when, ugh, but like, why? Why is this the hill to die on? And then a lot of times, like, because no one says, I don't care about culture because I'm racist or I don't care because I'm sexist.
Right.
What they say, what, DJ, what do you hear people say when they say, I don't care about knowing someone's culture? Why do they say? What's like the next part of that sentence? Because I
I
treat
mean,
people,
it's oh, like they don't see it, like they don't see a race or they don't see the differences. Everyone's treated the same.
yeah,
Is that what you're
it,
getting at? Hmm.
yes. Thank you for not reading my mind. Just kidding. But yeah, the I don't see color, I see people. I don't see culture, I see
Right,
people. And it's like, you can't separate completely a person from their culture, from their
right,
experience. And when I talk about culture, I mean not just race, ethnicity, like, those kind of things are the low hanging fruit, but everything from socioeconomic status, gender, sex, BTQ, like all of these things factor into it. Abuse culture, right? All of this
right,
factors into someone's culture and identity. You can't ignore that. You just can't. Like it's impossible.
right,
You cannot say you
right,
don't see those things.
right. And I think, and that's like when we do biopsychosocials, right? And one of the first questions, right, are there any cultural
Biopsychosocials, we should
considerations?
define some of these things, DJ.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead with the definition.
So a biopsychosocial or BPS is essentially an assessment. It is how we determine the biological, psychological, and social, like sociological, Jesus, social or
Right,
sociological aspects of a person to be able to make diagnoses, treatment plans, levels of care, all that good stuff. So
right.
that's a
It's
BPS.
yeah, it's one of the most prominent probably assessments in the counseling world. But one of the first questions we ask, right? Are there any cultural considerations that are important to you? And the thing is like the fact that like how many how much effort and training I put into like don't ask the question like that because you're gonna get the answers or someone's like, are there any no. No, there's no none of that stuff. There's nothing I can think of. but ask, something about somebody about like, is there, values that are important to you? Is there family traditions? Is there a religion? Is there like, ask the question that kind of way so you can actually get somebody who's like, oh yeah, like these are things that are important to me versus like, they're almost always going to get, no, nothing like that's important to me.
You people who only listen on audio, first off, thanks. But secondly, you missed some really great facial expressions from that, because it's the biggest eye roll, because that question is pretty much on every biopsychosocial ever, is because it's required. So even what's required on our documentation, if you are held to any accrediting body standards, like you bill certain insurances or are certified by certain bodies or accredited, you have to follow rules of what needs to be on forms, like the minimum requirements. And one of those things is to ask. And for some reason, every company I've ever seen an assessment, they ask it the same way. To just the guidance language to the person asking the question is, do you have any cultural concerns or issues? And sometimes it's followed
Yeah.
up that may impact care. And
Yeah.
so even clinicians that are seasoned, that it's just been like kind of ingrained that like, yeah, like I see these things as I go, but I don't know how to ask this question because it's a loaded question. And DJ's exactly
Right.
right. The biggest answer is no. Because when we think about like, this may impact service, it's like, okay, do you need, like, people's mind goes to, do you need to pray at a certain time of the day? Do you need a certain kind
Right.
of diet if we're in a residential facility? Do you need, what accommodations do we have to make? Can you attend groups on a Sunday? But that's not, I mean, those are important for sure, but that's not what that question's getting at.
Right. Right. And like I've seen it come up. I had a patient transferred to me and who struggles with language, who has like, some stuff going on, but also one of the things that wasn't considered is that this person, English is not their first language that they speak most of the time in their life. So like, thinking about, is someone like switching between like different languages during the day? Like, that's important information to know when you're working with someone, so that also you're not making judgment based on information that you don't have. And how we can make, a judgment, especially if English isn't someone's first language, or even if it's not the language that they're talking in 75% of their day, it would be good to know that before you make inferences that like somebody may be struggling with, like, wow, they're struggling with language. Well, maybe they're not speaking that language that much.
Yeah, and unfortunately, sometimes people have that bias of like, oh, they're not good at speaking English. They must have some sort of developmental disability, or
Exactly.
or we perceive having difficulty speaking English somehow is perceived as lack of intelligence, which is the silliest thing I could imagine. Like, you drop me in
Exactly.
a
Right.
country of a language that I don't speak at home all the time, and I'm gonna
Right.
struggle. So when
Oh
people
yeah.
are able to be, code switch between the two, this language switch and everything between the two, I'm honestly
Right.
more impressed than anything.
Right.
Yeah. But
Right.
I think like for counselors who are very comfortable with their own understanding of culture, with their own ability to see culture without asking about culture, see these things. Because it's like, if I ask the question to a client, tell me about your family, I'm going to learn so much about them in like the next sentence they say. Not just, if the person decides to say like, oh yeah, I'm married, we have this many kids. Cool. I learned that they're married and have this many kids. But I also learned that they don't think of their family of origin when they hear family. They
Right.
hear their family of creation, right? Or,
Right.
or they're not, they hear described the nuclear family. They only focused on that versus, oh yeah, I've got this many cousins, I got this many uncles, I got this, that, and the other. That
Right.
paints a very, very different picture of culture without me
Right.
even saying, what does family mean to you? I can ask one
Right.
question and get so much information from it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So much more than you would if you were like, are there any cultural implications that are important to you?
Exactly. Yes,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely. So I have probably a very loaded question that I want to make sure that we get to in our time together. So, like I said at the top, it's 2024. It's an election.
Mm-hmm.
It's election year. I live in, and DJ used to live in, a very battleground state. And so hearing about politics all the time, I don't know if you hear it as much in Portland because I think things are a bit more homogenous there, perhaps,
Right.
than in the
Well,
purple
in
state of
Portland,
Ohio.
in Portland, yes, yes. I mean, again, like a lot of Oregon is rural, but in Portland, yes, everybody is pretty much very, very liberal thinking.
So we're going to hear a lot for the next many months. And even after the election, it used to kind of be like, November, whatever, 3rd or 4th, whatever the day after the Tuesday was kind of a reprieve of like, it's done. We can stop watching, these political
Right.
ads and all this kind of stuff all the time and this mudslinging. But it's clear in the last several years it's not going to stop. It hasn't stopped, and I don't foresee this election cycle being any different than 2024 as far as the conversation continuing. So
Mhm.
knowing that, what's kind of your thoughts, your plan, whatever that might be about how are you going to manage with your clients in the next X amount of months while this comes up? Because I'll tell you an interesting story that showed a lot of my personal bias that was really interesting when it came up for me.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to like, politics, wouldn't bring up politics in a session, right? And if someone's bringing it up, I want to focus on like what the impact is on them, the emotional impact, what they're going in, what their investment is, that kind of stuff. But it can be harder, like I said, if someone has the same kind of political beliefs, not to like discuss like the politics, so I try to like, okay, wait a second, this is not what we're here for. But I mean, I think especially now because like, with this 2024 election being a sequel to
A rematch.
the rematch, right, to the last election. And we don't often or in my lifetime I can't readily think of this happening.
And DJ's
So I
lifetime is
think
longer than my lifetime, so
and yeah, it's a very much longer. And and also thinking about, and I think the other part of that is that like it's not just, I think we're in a more heated environment because it's not just that, it's the what happened after the election. It's also what happened in 2020, like to our entire world, So I think that like when everyone's kind of a little bit on edge because you'll see the memes that are like, it's 2024 or is it? Like what's happening next? Because it seems like 2020 redo,
it's Groundhog's Day.
right?
It's going to be interesting. It's going to be, I don't know. I tend to talk a little bit about politics with folks if they kind of linger to it necessarily because I've worked with people that like the laws and who's in charge really impact their life, right? So like there's been elections
Right,
where to me it's really like people tend to not always be the most educated on some issues because we like to vote with emotions. Like even if we think that we don't, we
right,
do. So like there's been many times where I've worked with people that I'm like, they'll have such strong beliefs, and I think about, and I'm sure I do it too, because I'm absolutely sure that I'm blind to my own stuff, absolutely.
right,
But to think about like, you know, like you are vote like someone was told me what they were voting for. I'm like, you are voting for a person who wants to cut services or cut these resources that you're a beneficiary of, right? Like,
right. Yeah,
but it's not on me to say like change your mind because this thing, right? Maybe they did weigh the pros and cons and decide that this is the candidate that most aligns. But it is difficult when people are so staunch on one side or the other.
right,
I have a hard time kind of holding back and I do, but it always comes up to me that I'm just like, I am not here to respond to what they're saying. I'm here to
right,
reflect what they're saying, bring it back to how does this impact you when sometimes that's really, really hard.
right. Yeah, yeah. It is hard. I mean, to keep that stuff aside. And again, I do find it harder when, they're talking passionately about something that I might also feel passionately about to be like, okay, we're not gonna get into like this whole political discussion because like that's not what we're here for. But it can be difficult. When they don't have the same beliefs, it's easier because I know that like, okay, I'm not gonna put a name my bias here and that's easy. I'm just not gonna say anything about it because we definitely do not agree on this area.
I had a time, when I was a baby counselor, right? So when I just started practicing, and I think it was the one of the first kind of election seasons, there was a big issue on the ballot that I felt strongly about because I did a lot of research into it. It was something that I supported, but I didn't support how it was like written. So
Mm,
I felt a certain way about it. I did a lot of education. I spent a lot of time. So psychologically, I was very invested in my belief. And I I always do, because that first year taught me a lot about how my bias came up for me in that was a client was telling me about their views on it. And they were, just responding to that, like, what is the issue? Yes, I'm in favor of that, not the what all does this impact? And that year, because I always put out brochures on how to register to vote, many people in Ohio who are felons don't realize they are eligible to vote. And that's a
mm,
whole different thing about not allowing people of an entire group to not vote, but whatever. So
right,
I always try to educate, like, even if you're a felon, you could still vote. You literally just can't vote from the penitentiary. Like, that's it. You
right,
can still fill out an absentee ballot from jail. Like, you can still do that. That is still your right. And that, like, it came up for me for like a second, and it was very much that first thought, wrong thought, which is where, like,
right,
the first thing that comes to your mind is the thing that's ingrained, not the thing that you're perhaps valuing today. My first thought
right.
was, do I tell them this year that they're eligible to vote? Because this guy doesn't think he's eligible to vote. And then as soon as that thought crossed my mind, I'm like, whoa, like, I need to do some introspection on this. And I did ultimately, obviously, tell everyone and gave them brochures. Here's how you register to vote. Here's, this is your rights on how to vote, yada, yada. But
Right,
it was a
right,
awakening for me.
right, right. And I think that's what, that's what we do in our career is continue to like check our biases, continue to like try to like, get more and more blind spots out of the way and, try to be, as open, as we can be, to be able to work with like all different people, whatever their beliefs are.
Remember, one of our professors in grad school did this. And hi to any of our grad school friends that are listening. Hi, guys. If you remember, maybe DJ, maybe you remember the professor who did this. I think I might know. They gave us a list of different kind of biases that people have. And they said, like, who would you struggle to work with, basically? And I remember going through the list because it stands out to me that one of the things was like sex offenders. And I'm like, no, I wouldn't have a problem with that. And I've stories and reasons why, but in my mind, I'm like, I don't have a bias. And that was the one that everyone in the class was like, oh yeah, that would be hard. And I remember thinking, like, first off,
Hmm.
I am so much better than everyone because I don't have that bias. But I was biased about it because I also said, no, I wouldn't struggle in talking about political beliefs with people. But then I realized, like, that is not true. That is a growing point that I've had to have over the years.
Right,
Whose
right.
class was
Yeah.
that?
It had to have been ethics.
Was that D
It
Hus?
had to been, it had been D-Hus, yeah. Every time I think about ethics, though, I always think like it depends. I'm like, oh my God, everything doesn't. It depends. We do have to sit in gray. However, like there are some things that are clearly ethical and clearly not ethical.
Yes. And
Hmm.
unfortunately, we get a newsletter quarterly of those people who did not realize what was so
Right,
like.
right,
That's the fun. That's like the
right.
gossip and like the counseling world is when the newsletter comes out and there's like uh, the list of different disciplines given that like last quarter,
Hmm.
and like what it was. It just gives you like the title, doesn't say the facts of it, and then what was the outcome. And so I always like, it's fascinating to me and also
I've
heartbreaking.
never, I've never read one, but I do know in
What?
California, I haven't. I'm gonna have to check one out. But in
Mm-mm.
California, when you register to, start accruing your hours to get independently licensed, which in California you have to. I know in Ohio, that's the other thing is you can be an LPC forever, but in California you can't. Um,
Which
but when you,
definition?
yeah, LPC, licensed practical counselor.
Professional counselor. Um,
Professional, and that's the
and
one that you can't work in private practice with an LPC, right?
you can have a consulting and do it, but it depends on
Uh,
how you bill. But like people, if you get your master's degree and you take your test, you can get an LPC and then you can maintain it forever. And LPCs allow you to treat mental illness. It does not allow you to independently diagnose. You have to go through 2 years of supervision, 4,000 hours, and it has to be 2
Is it
hours of
4,000
supervision.
now?
It's work hours. Yeah, because it's 2 years.
Yeah.
And you have to have, I'm sorry, it's 3,000 work hours, 1,500 have to be
Right.
with clients. You have to work with your supervisor 2 hours every single week. It's really intense to get that
Right.
second
Right.
C, the LPCC, to diagnose independently.
Right.
But I digress.
Yeah,
Please continue.
yes, thank you for that. But in California, you have to do that. So you can't, you register as a, I think they call it now an APC or an APCC associate. And then you do your supervised hours and not the testing and everything and get your independent license, but you have to do it in Ohio. And now I forget why I was talking about that. Oh, when you register, you get a brochure. Like, here's your registration number, here's this brochure, and it's entitled Psychotherapy Never Includes Sex.
Oh my God.
Yes.
I was going to
So
first make a joke about the fact they give you a
unethical.
brochure. I was going
Yeah.
to make a joke about
And
how
that's
they make a brochure. That's hysterical. But
yeah,
the rest
that's
is
the
not
brochure.
hysterical.
Right, yeah. So as we say, like, ethics are important.
Well, I think we've really come full circle to come back to like counseling and licensure and all of that stuff, and why, why as counselors, as therapists, it's important to say like there are professional accomplishments with that. So,
Right.
yeah, this was good. I like this. This
Yes.
was a good.
Yes.
We didn't debate as much as I was hoping. I was kind of like coming for you.
No.
Just kidding.
There'll be other topics for sure where we definitely get into some debate.
I'm sure. Well, DJ, do you want to pick this up next week?
Let's do it, Dee.
All right. Thanks everybody for listening. Please like, subscribe, leave a 5-star review if you're listening on Apple Podcast or Spotify. That really helps people find us. We greatly appreciate it. So thanks everybody.
Thanks.